from what I gather, most of your explorations tend to be in North London, Middlesex, those kind of areas. Do you look at other towns and places in the same way? If you went to Cleethorpes or Rotherham or Totnes, would you approach it in the same minute detail as London and Middlesex?
Due to a strange sequence of events, I ended up as a senior lecturer in English at the Polish Naval Academy in Gdynia, and I pursued the same procedures in the coastal lands of Poland, and eventually got accused of being a spy. This was just after the wall came down. No, I do focus on North London, but I tend to take my bad habits with me wherever I go. I was up in Cambridge recently, and I was kind of threading through the town and making my own sorts of connections. So I'm always on duty.
Thank you. Who are you next? Tom.
Thanks, that was great. Really enjoyed it. I just wondered what you thought about Ian Sinclair's idea that came a couple of times, that the edgelands are an endangered resource, that they're retreating and perhaps they're being recreated in the centre of the city. Do you think that's the case, or is that only one part of the story?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I do have a deep and abiding affection for the old brownfield sites that have disappeared over the last 20 years and have been turned into luxury housing estates and the like, and I am a bit of a conservative with a small c, and yearn for the past a little bit and think that things have been spoilt now. But really, if I were to engage fruitfully with the landscape, I would just have to take what is given to me, so that if all those brownfield sites disappear and are converted into the most dull and bland sorts of modern housing estates, I would have to work with that material, and I've no doubt that I would find something that was meaningful to me. Besides which, people who grow up after me, young children now, are just going to take that landscape as a given, and then when that gets converted into something else, they'll be conservatives with a small c. There isn't any kind of real fixed position here about this sort of thing. I used to think there was, but I find as I get older I'm questioning that in myself.
John.
Yeah, I'm not sure as well. I think who'd ever want to contradict Ian Sinclair? He's kind of like there's a kind of cultish religious thing to this, and sort of Ian Sinclair is like the great magus of this, isn't he? He's the godhead of this movement. So, but now I'm going to commit a heresy. I don't think that hollowing out of the city that Ian's talking about is actually happening so much. Particularly when you look at it happens in temporary phases. If you go through King's Cross. At the moment, it has happened there, but it won't. You've got vistas now across King's Cross from the north that haven't been there for 200 years. You've got a clean view down into the city across the station, but in a year's time that'll be gone. So, and I don't think it's simple as that. There was a lot of theory about this hollowing out of the city, but I think on the other hand, you can find remoteness in the city on, say, a Sunday evening in the city of London. I walked on the Walbrook one Sunday night. I didn't meet a soul along the whole length of the Walbrook, whereas if I were rambling in the Chilterns, I'd be tripping over people every 10 yards, so it's a fluid thing, I think.
Thank you. Another question, please.
So you were involved in helping Will Self with the Book of Dave, which I've just finished reading, actually. A marvellous book, very difficult but marvellous book. For those who haven't read it, it's kind of a future society that's based on the teachings or the ramblings of a black cab driver that gets buried and then dug up in the future, and it becomes the basis of a society. My question is, have you ever thought about what the Book of Nick would be if, like, you buried your own writings and a future society based their society on your teachings? What would that society look like?
You've really got me stuck there, actually. John might have some ideas.
Yeah, right. That's rip. It would be mental, wouldn't it? I think a Nick world would be great, but I think it would probably involve consuming copious amounts of magic mushrooms as an initiation rite, which I suppose is like there is parallels with that, I suppose, in ancient Amazonian societies. But it would involve worshipping utilities, public utilities. I think you would literally be prayer mats. You'd have to kneel towards Mogden after flushing the toilet, flush the toilet, and say a little prayer to the great sewage god. Do you approve of that?
I think that's right. John knows me better than I know myself.
Fantastic. Tom?
I was going to say, in the film we saw a lot of you walking apparently on your own, although I do understand there was a cameraman there, and some of you walking with other people. Do you find it more productive to go on walks on your own, or do you, do you find it helps to have someone else's perspective as you're walking?
Well, obviously, some people are better to walk with than others. I enjoy walking with other people a lot, and obviously other people can inform my perceptions. I walk with my girlfriend a lot, and she's got a good eye for little details in the landscape as it passes us that I would miss, partly because her eyesight's a lot better than mine. But there is something about walking alone that is very precious for me, and I feel sometimes when I'm walking alone that some kind of spirit is walking alongside me, or that I'm zoning in on a kind of trace of somebody or something that has passed that way shortly before I've turned up, and this person, spirit, I don't know who or what it is, I do sense that one day I'm going to be on one of my walks and I'm going to turn a corner and they'll be there, and that'll probably be the day I drop dead. But I do feel that there's this kind of presence that comes to me when I'm walking. It's very, very precious, that. It's a bit grim, isn't it? It's like spoil the evening now. Shall I just go home?
I've got a question to follow that. John, we've seen Nick walking in the film, but you were there with your camera. What's your experience of walking in London, and in particular walking and filming Nick at the same time?
It's very different. Walking with Nick is not like walking with anybody else, which I think the film, in a way, when I was cutting the film, there was a couple of sort of things I wanted to get across, and one of them was Nick's practice, which was one thing. Another thing was the experience of walking with Nick, and that is kind of what it's like the entire time. You know, it is. Well, you don't know, do you? But so the experience. We do a radio show, actually. I was hoping you were going to mention that. You deleted that. We do a radio show on Resonance FM. And they're all podcasted. There's about 20 of the podcasts, and we walk for sort of for about 6 hours, and end up with 4 hours of audio, of which 3 hours and 45 minutes is Nick. You know, but it's all interesting. You know, you don't want to really lose any of it. So it's a fascinating thing, and it's quite. But we have very different experiences of walking and what we see in the landscape. We did a walk out near sort of from Grange Hill to Loughton. And we were walking across this muddy field, and Nick said, "Oh, John, what do you feel when you walk through here?" And I went, "Oh, it sort of reminds me of being a kid, really. It reminds me of going out for walks with my dad and pigeon shooting and that kind of thing, poaching, I suppose. Farmers would call it." And I went, "What about you, Nick?" And he went, "Oh, I see." And it was just this mad sort of like psychedelic vision of obscure radio stars from the 1930s meeting horrible deaths impaled on a spike on a combine harvester, and it's just wow. So it works quite well, doesn't it? Combination two things. But walking alone, I think walking alone is definitely a different experience. I think there are phases I think you go through on a walk, where the first bit is you've got your conscious mind with you, which is you're sort of going, "Oh, this is what's happening with the school at the moment, and the wife's just said this, and there's that thing on the telly later." And then there's a point where that starts to leave you, and you start to become more aware of where you are, and you forget about the water bottle sloshing in your bag, and then there's a point where the boundaries cease to be there anymore. So the experience of the place, your own experience of walking and where you are in time, they do start to merge, and that's when it becomes a lot more of an interesting experience. Very difficult to do that if you're walking for somebody, because you tend to socialise, don't you? That's why the Ramblers don't really walk, do they? They just have a moving conversation. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question?
I was just going to ask, you mentioned that you were a lecturer for a while and you've got the book, and you just mentioned the radio, but I was wondering what other kind of outputs you've had from your work and your observation along the way. Do you write poetry, for example?
I keep notebooks, but I've got to admit I haven't been very good with that recently. I finished my book Scarp in February, and I've been utterly burned out since then. And in fact, I'm having a kind of micro-nostalgia for the days when I used to write, which wasn't that long ago, actually. But I am a bit burnt out at the moment. It's a funny thing. I thought there'd be a build-up of confidence from writing a novel about walking and topography, and I found that I'm as stumped now as I was when I originally got the book deal. I haven't learnt anything, and I just don't know what I'm going to do next. But yes, I do keep notebooks, and well, on the recent walks I've done, I have done a little bit of writing. I have 2 notebooks. I have an A4 notebook, and I have a very small notebook, like a moleskin. The problem is I'm not quite sure what function the 2 notebooks fulfil, and I don't know whether I'm supposed to write in the moleskin and then transfer the material to the larger notebook, and it's got a bit complicated, whereas in the days when I only had 1 notebook it was a little bit more straightforward. But my notebooks are around, and I'm hoping they'll be found in a skip in Southgate in 40 years' time by somebody like me, and that there'll be that kind of radio transmission directly to the centre of their cortex, and they'll know what I'm talking about. Because despite all the social media stuff that's increasingly going on around this, I think at heart this is a hermetic tradition that we're perpetuating here.
Thank you.
I was wondering, I quite like that idea that I think it was Russell Brand mentioned about how there's that possibility of walking a certain route or visiting somewhere where no one has been before or is unexplored. And I'm wondering, Nick, to what extent that you might, say, explore certain neighbourhoods certainly in a city like London, which has been, scrutinised and kind of explored so much already. Do you kind of approach areas for want of a better word, in a random way, or do you kind of sort of search out areas you want to explore beforehand that are perhaps not likely to have been explored ever before?
I do all sorts of things, and it's not so much procedural as ill discipline and things evolving just in their own kind of random way. I find year by year I tend to find myself focusing on one particular area. Last year, obviously, I looked at the North Middlesex, South Hertfordshire borderlands for my book, and I was driven there by my contractual obligations and my desire to produce a work. This year I seem to be doing a lot of North West Middlesex, places like Pinner and Ruislip. But to get closer to answering your question, I can be a bit kind of hostile and egomaniacal sometimes, and I really like it when I have a kind of walking theme or a topographic theme, and I look on the internet and there's nothing else on the internet about it. I really like to feel that I'm kind of going out on my own somewhere, and it's a kind of a bit of a bad habit. It's probably even a bit pathetic, really, but it keeps me on my edge anyway, and keeps me working. I don't really know how to answer your question. There's just so many different things that can take place, and while I may have my procedures, they're not honed in that kind of way. What about you, John?
Well, no, it's interesting, that idea, isn't it? Because I remember when I did the classic backpacking thing, and you go to northern Thailand and you meet someone in a cafe and they went, I've discovered this place. You know, you think, you probably didn't. I think there's people living there. You discovered it because you're from Maidenhead, but you didn't discover. You know, and I remember feeling that when I was in the Golden Triangle. So the idea that you might go, I've discovered this place, it's in Ruislip, it's even more preposterous in a way. Although there are times when it feels like that, and in a way it almost was more authentic in a way that when you go to the Golden Triangle, if you're from Maidenhead. Because you're probably having a similar experience to most of the other people from Maidenhead. You know, you have a dodgy massage and a pipe of Ipium. And whereas opposed, you know, not many people do walk through Middlesex and see the things maybe that Nick sees. You know, I think Nick might genuinely have discovered Mogden purification works. I think everyone else thought it was a sewage treatment works, whereas you've discovered it as this incredible temple. But it is an interesting idea, that, and it's interesting that because. But when I did my backpacking 20 years ago, that was what it was all about. It was all about going out into the, you know, seeing how remote. I went up a river in Borneo in a boat and stayed with headhunters. I thought that was a cool thing to do. Whereas now I go to Ilford. And so probably there's a room full of people who also probably do the same thing, which is interesting. If you went, let's go to Borneo, they go, nah, it's passé.